my life.
Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5. As a church, we've obviously had Easter, we had baptisms, but just coming back to this sermon series in Matthew's Gospel, going through the Sermon on the Mount, and we arrive at, for some, no doubt, a difficult subject, but an important one. The title above just 2 verses is Divorce, and reading these 2 verses from verse 31. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. Now, I grew up in 1 Holly Bank, Leicester Road, Market Harborough. It was a lovely house, Victorian actually, so high ceilings, big garden, 4 boys running around in, and I guess from the outside, we possibly could have looked like the complete family. Everything looked all together. But inside, it became a broken home when I was about 12, 13, roughly that kind of age. Shockwaves went through the town. What? The doctor's family? Yes, the doctor's family. So I approach today knowing something of the shame and pain that breakdown in the marriage relationship causes. First to the husband and the wife, and then the children and the grandparents and wider family and friends, church family if Christians get divorced. Maybe you know something of that pain yourself. And if so, I recognise that the next 20 minutes or so may be particularly difficult for some perhaps. But these verses, important for all, as divorces all around. If not within our own families or if not within our own friends, then certainly amongst the people that we move amongst. Marriages are being entered into more likely these days without sober reflection. Divorce is happening more and more and becoming easier. The media and some celebrity examples haven't helped. Ridiculous television programs on marriage at first sight. Celebrities. I remember not that long ago, Chris Martin and Gwyneth Paltrow married for 10 years, but then they announced a few years ago now they were consciously uncoupling after 10 years of marriage. The term kind of made it all sound okay, yeah, okay, everyone was okay. But they weren't consciously uncoupling. They were getting divorced, and it wasn't okay. And it would have caused a lot of people a lot of pain and a lot of heartache. So just allow me to use the illustration. We're over the worst of COVID. You know, it's caused much worldwide pain. And not that long ago, how baffling it was that the Chinese authorities would not allow scientists into the marketplaces and science laboratories of Wuhan to get to the cause of the problem. Surely tracing the cause could prevent similar reoccurrences in the future. Perhaps even find a cure. And that's what Jesus is doing here. He's seeking to get to the cause of the problem. Of easy divorce and wrongful divorce in God's eyes, with all the pain and damage involved in that. And so doing so, bring prevention, perhaps bring a cure, certainly halt the spread of it. Now, Jesus' words here, they're part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus has been teaching his followers, his disciples, what it means to live out his commands. And here now, just before these verses, been speaking on adultery, bringing this kind of radical teaching, the challenging teaching. You know, you commit adultery if you look at someone lustfully and you imagine and you perhaps consider the sexual possibilities. But here he goes on here to say, well, there's another way that you can cause adultery. And that is through wrongful divorce. Verse 32 again, it says, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to become an adulteress. Now, divorce is a controversial subject. It's debated subject. It's debated, not least, probably more fervently among Christians. You know, much has been written to explain, whether it be the verses I've read and numerous other verses in the Bible, and you probably get conservative scholars disagreeing with liberal scholars, but actually it's more than that. Sometimes it can feel like everyone's disagreeing with everyone else. And so today, here in the short time we have, unfortunately, got to disappoint you. You're not going to get something cut and dried. But what I can do and must do is attempt to have a go at these verses. And we'll do that by bringing chunks of verses elsewhere. You know, that will help us. And as we do and we look at them and we consider what's behind them, you know, please don't think here, well, I'm not divorced, it's got nothing to do with me. Jesus' words, they ripple throughout eternity, and they ripple into every home today, whether we're engaged or single or divorced or happily married for 40, 50, 60 years. Not to mention these verses do lead us into some general applications that definitely apply to us all. Firstly, from these verses, Jesus wants to bring an end to easy divorce. So let us just suppose you're married, and after some time you meet someone that actually seems more desirable to you than your present partner. You kind of fancy him or her. Or to tell the truth, you lust after him or her, and yet you are a professing Christian. You know, what should you do? There's probably numerous options. But one of them is certainly to repent of that sin and ask for God's help in your marriage. But the other option may be that, you know, you're likely to consider in some way how you can fulfill that lust and yet somehow stay in God's favour inside God's will. And that is what the Jews would do in Jesus' day. They would search the Bible, the Old Testament, they would search the book of Deuteronomy, and hey presto, there's a verse. And it's these verses, these 4 verses in Deuteronomy, it says this. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, he writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house. And after she leaves this house and she becomes the wife of another man, and the second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry again, and she has been defiled. This would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. You see, first century Jewish society, they looked down upon women. Women had no rights, they had no protection. Wives, in some cases, were treated terribly, and some husbands would leave their wives for trivial reasons, like burning the dinner, for example. If they thought that they could marry someone more desirable, historians will tell you that. And so they would go and they would use Deuteronomy, and they would get that certificate that they needed, and that would be great because then they could divorce her legally and they could remarry legally, and more importantly actually is that they could not sin apparently and remain in God's favour, remain inside God's will. Not so, says Jesus. And Jesus' words become a reality check. It has been said, after summarising Deuteronomy 24, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you, here it comes, Jesus' greatest standard in the Sermon on the Mount. But I tell you, anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So look, many Jewish husbands were saying, look, Deuteronomy 24. Moses commands me to go to get my certificate. My divorce is legal. Here's my certificate. It's all okay. Everyone's okay. It's all okay with God. And Jesus says, no, it's not okay. Firstly, in Deuteronomy, it's a concession, not a command. It's a concession from God, which means you don't have to divorce. You don't have to divorce and leave your wife for another. Besides, Deuteronomy 24 actually says A man marries a woman and becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her. And the words indecent here come from the one Greek word which means porneia, meaning sexual immorality. So it involves a wife to be found with sexual immorality, perhaps even adultery herself, as grounds for the husband's getting a certificate to make the divorce legal. So she hasn't just burnt the dinner. She hasn't just come back from the hairdressers with a little bit too much chopped off. She hasn't just come back late from a shopping trip. No. The legal piece of paper might not make it right with God. And in fact, what's this legal piece of paper? What's that going to do? At the end of the time when we all have to stand in front of our Maker, the Maker of heaven and earth, and when he looks back upon every moment of our life, what are we going to do? We're going to wave a little flimsy certificate of divorce and say, here it is, Lord. No, it's not going to cut it in God's eyes. And so Jesus is tackling easy divorce here, but he's also addressing the problem of twisting verses to kind of legitimize sinful behaviour. Because we can do that. Some people spend their whole lives doing that. Whether in the context of marriage or not, or sexual immorality or not. But we need to be careful for twisting verses in the Bible to suit our selfish wants. That is living in empty religion on our terms as opposed to relationship with God on his terms. We need to be careful with that attitude that thinks, well, how close to the line can a guy go and yet get away with it? And remain in God's will. Can I even sin and keep my conscience intact? Our attitude should not be how close to the line can I go to get away with it. It actually should be the opposite. Think of those verses that is in the realms of sexual immorality in the book of 1 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul, he says, flee sexual immorality. And there's flee as far away you can get to from those boundary lines. He says, for the purpose of staying pure and holy for God's glory. Firstly, Jesus dealing with easy and wrongful divorce. And secondly, it goes on really in these verses to show just how this all affects other people. Because of course, living with that attitude that says, you can live how you want as long as your conscience is okay, twisting verses to suit our wants, living an empty relationship on our terms as opposed to relationship with God on his terms, will ultimately lead others to sin, causes others to sin, just as it does with divorce. Verse 32 again. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. Jesus directing us forward here to think about this divorced woman, this divorced wife in the future, perhaps in a few years' time, where she meets someone, perhaps a really nice bloke who loves her and cares for her and gets married to her according to Jesus. She's committed adultery, and so has the man who marries her. And they have been led that way, they have been caused that way by the husband of the first marriage. Jesus lays the blame squarely with him. Because divorce affects not only the guilty party, but also the innocent party, if there is one. As one writer puts it, they become unwitting accessories in the eyes of God. Sinclair Ferguson, he writes this: divorce on unbiblical ground complicates sin rather than cures it. And it may implicate others in sin rather than absolve them altogether. And so Jesus is saying, look, you need to take care in just following your own desires, because some of them will be sinful and some of them will lead others into sin. And of course, Christians, followers of Jesus, need to be people who do not lead others into sin. We are to be people who lead others out of sin. And actually, Jesus, this is a warning here, and Jesus is very strong in this warning here, because later on he goes on to say in chapter 18, he says, woe to anyone who causes my little ones to sin, it would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a millstone around his neck. But what then of the case where divorce takes place on the grounds which our Lord has permitted? Is the offended party free to marry again? Well, under the law of Moses, the penalty for adultery was death by stoning. Thus, the offended party was free by the death of the guilty spouse to marry again. Thank goodness. Thank goodness. Stoning no longer takes place in most cultures, but nonetheless, the offended party is still released to marry again. Another Bible commentator says this: the inference being the person is unfaithful, has broken the marriage bond, and the other person is therefore freed from the obligations of marriage, as though their former spouse were died. They are free to marry again. But again, I should stress that divorce is not a command, it's a kind of permittance. Christians must also always seek for reconciliation and restoration with a relationship, and divorce should be a last resort. If all else fails, a reluctant last step. And the guilty party will have to forgive themselves and sin no more. The offended party, there's enormous hurt that has to be healed, and perhaps even unwarranted guilt that needs to be dealt with before remarriage is considered. Now, the cure and corrective for this within marriages and within our society is a greater understanding of marriage. And bringing the verses later on in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 19, we can just read a few verses from there. Some Pharisees came to him to test him, and they asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made male and female," he said, and said, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one. Therefore what is going joined together, let no man separate." "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces a wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery." The disciples said to him, "This is a situation between a husband and a wife. Is it better not to marry?" Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it's been given. For some are eunuchs because they've been born that way, and others have been made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage. Because of the kingdom of heaven, the one who can accept this should accept this." Did you spot the focus? Did you spot the focus of the Pharisees? They want to talk about Deuteronomy 24 and divorce. Jesus wants to talk about the meaning of marriage, chapter 2. And he wants to talk about marriage. He wants to talk about Genesis 2 and marriage. Because marriage is of God. God is the maker of marriage. And he is the maker of this spiritual union within marriage. One Christian writer puts it, marriage is a creative act of God. There are two, and the two are joined together, not ultimately by their own decision making or their own relationship building, but by God himself. And the two become one. Something new has entered the created world that never existed before. The union is spiritual. The Apostle Paul calls it a mystery in Ephesians 5, expressed by the physical act of love shown in marriage. And so when one is unfaithful, this mysterious, physical, spiritual bond is broken and divorce becomes permissible on these most serious of grounds. And no wonder there are so many spiritually wounded people in our society today. Now, as we close, we're going to take communion very shortly. Is it like one or two people thinking, well, what about my divorce? What about my situation? Yeah, okay, it wasn't adultery, but it felt like adultery. What then? I have to say, I don't know. I don't know. My eyes have been going around all week, and at the end of this, I'm going to go home and lie in a dark room with cucumbers over my eyelids. But it's been a difficult week, and they're actually the hard verses. And what I do know is Malachi chapter 2 tells me that God hates divorce, but he loves the divorced person. And divorce, for whatever reason, is not the unforgivable sin. And many people here will know that full relationship with God is possible after divorce, after healing, after bitterness is removed out of one's own heart. So you might be really disappointed in your marriage. Perhaps that hasn't turned out that way, in the way that you hoped. And yet, out of your love for God and knowing that you're safe to do so, that you decided to keep going, keep persevering, keep forgiving, keep praying, keep praying. And if that is the case, then you may know that you have a special place in Jesus' heart, who himself, he left heaven, left the home of the Father, and he comes and he marries a wandering, unfaithful, unholy bride. And yet he remains completely committed to her, completely committed to us, to me and you. And he always will, because he loves us. He loves us. And he showed us the full extent of how he loves us. And that's when we come to the communion table.
The fire in my heart, be the wind in these sails, be the reason that